After more than a decade of war and continuous deployments, it's not only our service members serving overseas who are at risk, their families are too. A RAND survey looked at how military dependents are coping with the wartime deployments of one or both of their parents. The survey found higher levels of anxiety and emotional and behavioral difficulties beyond the national average. If you're an educator, the question becomes, what can you do to help this special group of children? To find answers, the Department of Defense gathered a group of teachers and counselors, all of whom have taught these children at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. What have they learned that they can share with teachers who have never taught military dependents? Is there a difference between teaching dependents of the Navy versus Army or Air Force versus Marines? How does growing up in a military culture impact these students? And what is the difference between teaching students whose parents are in the active, reserve, or National Guard components of their respective service? Even if you already know something about how our military operates, we hope you'll learn even more by watching this. So just to do a little bit more of the who you are. So how many of you, by a show of hands, how many of you are school teachers, not counselors? School teachers, okay. And how many of you are counselors? Yeah, okay, terrific. So that just gives us an overall sense of who's doing what. It sounds like everybody here has quite a breadth of experience in teaching military dependents. So let's take a minute to ask your advice, if you know, teachers who are watching this who don't have military kids, to sum up what are they up against? What's hard for them? What are the challenges for them when they come? So this is you talking to those teachers, things you need to know. So O'Neill, why don't we start with you?
I think one thing that's hard for them is balancing a challenging academic load along with kind of a could be fragile home life where they're not sure when they're moving, if dad's being deployed, when dad's coming back. I had a student 2 years ago who, I noticed, her mood change, and I started to pick up on it. Oh, dad's about to come back, dad's about to leave. So it gets pretty challenging to keep them engaged in an academic setting when things can be pretty fragile at home.
I just let my parents know right off the bat, whether they come in the first day of school or they come halfway into the school year, that I want to be informed of changes that happen at home. For example, if the father is about to deploy, or sometimes the moms deploy, and I want to be aware of that so that if I notice a change in the child in the classroom, in the back of my mind, I can think back, okay, maybe this is why.
Cameron?
I just wanted to share two things for teachers that may have never worked with military students before. One, to speak to the gap.
The gap in their education.
Right. I've seen several transcripts as a high school counselor where just because they've gone through geometry for the first half and they're moving in right after Christmas, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're ready for the second half of geometry. Mm-hmm. So in that case, you really do have to go to your teachers and say, look, work with the student, figure out where they are, and see if you can try to find some time.
But to recapitulate, so you're saying that kids, very often if you have a classroom full of kids from military backgrounds, they may actually come to you having gone through different curriculums in their previous schools, which could be anywhere, and so they don't all have the same base when they come into the classroom.
What you're teaching at that time might be repetition of something that they've already had, and there may be gaps that they don't get during that school year.
So they could be bored or they could be lost, depending on what they got at their previous school.
Right. One thing that I've also found helpful is when the person that is deploying, I like to get their email address as well, just to keep that open communication, because as the new normal, our children aren't with mom and dad. It might be a step parent, it might be a caregiver, an aunt, uncle, a grandparent. So when that main person might be that stability for that child is gone and now out of the country, they're still at home with somebody else. It might not be mom or dad, it might be a friend of a family.
What are the big buzzwords that teachers should know they're going to hear?
Rankings.
What does that mean?
Deployment.
Okay, deployment. That word's coming up again and again. Teachers need to know that deployment means something really specific and actually quite traumatic. What is it?
Differences between...
Well, what is deployment?
Well, you've got the pre-deployment and reintegration as well that has to go along with the deployment.
Okay, so I need somebody to, this was a quiz.
Okay, here we go.
All right, John.
Deployment is the military member actually moving to an overseas location, whether it be on a ship or whether it be to a land unit someplace overseas, someplace outside of their normal base environment.
Big important word in vocabulary.
Right.
Deployment.
Right, and that's going to be for X number of months, okay?
So it means go away from home for a long time
Right.
and maybe go to a war.
Right, absolutely right. And then as she was mentioning, the pre-deployment is the period of time up to that deployment date in which you have to get ready. So you're probably gone away from the home a lot, training and preparing to make that major deployment.
Okay, so there's
then
pre-deployment.
Pre-deployment.
There's
okay?
deployment.
Deployment.
There's also R&R, which takes place in the midst of a deployment, where the family member comes back for usually a period of 2 weeks of time. And sometimes the family has a general idea of when the active duty personnel is coming back, and sometimes they don't have exactly a pinpointed time.
So there's R&R.
Yes.
Stands for?
Rest and relaxation.
And sometimes R&R means 2 weeks in January, or my child's going to be going, or February, we're going to Disney World.
And you don't get to say no to that. You wouldn't want to say no.
Why they wouldn't? That's their
No.
only time with their family.
I just say, make sure you read while you're going.
One of the most volatile times, though, I think could be the integration, because they have a sense, oh, daddy's or mommy is coming home.
So another important term is reintegration.
Yes. The service member is coming back to their unit and their family, which in their mind, prior to the reintegration, is normally supposed to be a very happy time. You were very excited for, let's say in this case, daddy to come home. But sometimes it doesn't happen like that. There's a lot of, the service member might be tense, there might be friction, the roles have changed, the wife may want to continue doing the bills, and the service member wants to take that back. There's a lot of friction between, maybe there might be a teenager who kind of was the head of the household before, and dad comes in, and there's fights and tensions there. And I've, as experience as a counselor, have heard from some students where it's just not a pretty situation.
So
It's
teachers should
worse.
know. So teachers should know that when the parent comes home from overseas, that can be very complicated
Yes.
dynamic.
Yes.
It's not just it's not just the reintegration that can be the complication. A lot of times it's 6 months later that maybe PTSD sets in.
Yes.
And the after effects. Yes, there's all the excitement that comes with the coming home and the reintegration. But once that honeymoon period dies off, the rest of what's happened overseas or during the deployment in theater, another word, theater, that means they're in combat, is all of the emotions that now start to submerge and surface from the deployment.
And this is where you begin to see the social, emotional part of a military child. I think we see it more when the father or mother comes back from deployment and they're trying to stabilize the home again. And we've had several parents split, and the child is upset for weeks, longer than weeks.
Is the parent coming home from overseas as complicated as the parent going away?
It's more complicated.
It's more complicated.
It's easily
It's
more
more
complicated.
complicated.
And one thing that's
I don't
very,
think most teachers would know that.
one thing that's very helpful, that would be helpful to teachers know, is when they come home, if there is that aspect of PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, that like any sort of yelling in the classroom, that can trigger many emotions inside and set a child off. Because they're going to experience that in a great deal at home. Not just yelling, but maybe aggression or complete withdrawal. All of those are emotions that they would experience.
And we're talking about aggression, running out of the room, kicking the wall, going down the hallway, throwing themselves on the floor.
For a lot of students, the classroom is like their safe haven.
Really?
It's their one constant. It's the thing they can depend on.
The teacher is the constant and the stability. If there's friction at home between mom and dad or the caregivers, if the caregiver that was at home during the deployment is often caught in the middle. So while that person wants to please the person, like let's say dad or mom that came home, they're also an advocate for the children, so they're caught in the middle. So the teacher is the constant and the stability for the child. They're most likely not going to sway either way, depending on mom or dad's mood.
So do you all find that when kids are having these emotional difficulties related to parents coming and going off to war, that they do want to share with you as their teachers?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
You're the ones they turn to.
Right. And when they become something that is not within your ability to be able to handle, then you know when to defer off to your counseling and so forth.
Talk me through an example of that kind of conversation.
A couple years ago, I had a young lady whose father was getting ready to deploy. She was quite concerned about it. An incident happened when he was already deployed overseas, and she was really anxious about the whole situation because Mom had not been able to get word from her husband. In turn, she was worried. It reflected upon the child. And she finally came to me one day after school. She stood in my doorway, walked in, walked out, walked in, walked out, and I said, "Come on in. What's on your mind?"
You knew she wanted to talk.
Yes, and she just started crying. And after the crying stopped, I said, "What is it?" She said, "I haven't heard from Dad." "We haven't heard from Dad." And I said, "Okay, let's go up to the counseling office and let's sit down and hash this out." And there's no right answer you can give the child. Everything's going to be okay is not the answer, because you don't know.
O'Neill, you've been waiting a long time.
I'm sorry, but as a high school teacher, in my experience, I find those conversations to not happen very often.
No.
I find that when kids get to the high school level and get older, they become more skilled at masking and hiding and internalizing. And unless you're really vigilant as a teacher and very sensitive to what's going on, you will miss those things in the high school kids more often than not.
In the elementary school, I think children are quite different than we're quite different than the high school kids.
So, but let me ask, I want to really zero in on this. What didn't you know that you then had to know, Sharonda?
I didn't know about all the changes that they go through, military-dependent children versus civilian children. I didn't know that, you hear mom is in the military, dad is in the military, but you never really know, well, they leave for this amount of time or they go away. It's all just very vague when you hear it on TV or you hear it in conversation. But when it's actually in your classroom, oh, now I know what it means when dad goes away.
O'Neill, I want to ask you the same question. What did you not know?
I didn't know the ripple effects of a deployment or the reintegration. I just didn't know how that affected them emotionally, and it spilled out into their friendships. It spilled in, whether they're engaged in the classroom or disengaged. I didn't know when they said they hated their new city and their new school that it meant not necessarily that they hated their new school, but they hated that they had to leave this other place, and they hated that they had to break off a friendship that they had in the other place.
I want to go back and just finish a little bit of a section about vocabulary, because there was one more term that had been used that I don't know the meaning of. I mean, I'm kind of figuring it out, but I think I heard it as PCSing. Is that it?
Permanent change of station.
PCSing means what?
Permanent change of station.
Usually they PCS.
In English.
You're moving from point A to point B. It's usually every 3 to 4 years. You would permanently change your duty station.
Right.
All right, so I think we discussed in theater. In theater means in a war zone.
Right.
Is that a particularly stressful time for the kids above everything else when the parent's in a war zone?
Yes. Without a doubt, it's a very stressful period of time, because it's as a retired military member myself, you're worried about yourself, one, you're worried about the members of your team, two, and your family's worried about you. And there isn't a daily communication with your family. And so those communications you do have with your children become vitally important.
When kids from military families come into the school, do they walk in with it being obvious that they're from the military? Can you see it? Are they talking in military time and saying, "I'll see you at 1300 for lunch"? Or is it a stealth thing? You can't really tell.
One thing, and my husband was active duty for 26 years, so I've lived this as well, but something that has popped up to me is that I think there's a perception that if you are military, that you somehow are organized, disciplined, and together.
Great stereotype.
Yes, and that we put that forward, and I think we as a family try to do that as well. I think you're kind of expected to do that, and so you might be able to pick them out. Sometimes the boys have shorter hair. There's a lot more yes ma'am, no ma'am going on. But you scratch the surface, and sometimes it's very messy, very messy. And I didn't even know that.
It may not be so obvious. I mean, there's also the reserve component and the National Guard components that they may be miles and miles and miles away from the nearest base. So that child might be the only child in the entire school system per se that has a parent in the military. Makes a huge difference. May not huge, some other people might disagree, but for active duty, that parent is always going to work, that's their main job. They're in the military full time. They're going to their trainings and schools and off to different states for various reasons. When you have a child that has a parent that is reserve, they might go for once a weekend, maybe for a couple of weeks out of the year, but they also have maybe another full-time job, and then suddenly if they get activated, now this parent...
Activated means that they're called to duty?
They're called to active duty. Now this parent or this parent role is suddenly taking a new role as a primary job in the family, might be even gone, so that stability is gone. So there's I think a big difference.
Does it make a difference with these kids whether the parent is in the Army versus the Navy versus the Marines versus the Air Force? Is there a difference in how you experience that?
No, they're gone. They're still gone.
Not a big one, no.
It's about being gone,
It's
Yeah.
the absence that's...
and it's the unpredictability.
Right, absolutely right.
No, I want to kind of get a sense, I was getting at this a little bit before, but when I was asking, do you know if you have a military kid in your class? So you actually said there are some signs. If the kid has a neater haircut or calls you ma'am or sir. But aside from that, do you have any way of knowing? Is anybody telling you that you have kids in your class?
Well, parents.
Nobody's saying
That
it?
doesn't come down the pike to us.
There's no official...
There's no coding on rosters, there's no,
Well,
communication.
And the reason we're asking for that little bit of special attention is because just as the whole United States has reached out this time to our warriors, male and female, all over the United States when they go off and we're sent to Iraq and now Afghanistan and some of the other parts of the world, we need to reach out to those children too, because they are serving as well, just in a different way.
As a nation, we often ask what we can do to help those who have volunteered their careers and their lives to serve in the military. One answer is now clear. We can pay special attention to the needs of their children. Thanks for watching.